So in a way, alternative transportation should be a priority of Saratoga if we want to continue the type of economic success that we've had for all.
And walkability, and scale, and giving more dimension to the downtown. And by that I mean we need more than just the Broadway corridor to be the center of town. And by building a gigantic, massive parking structure on this particular piece of land, we're losing the ability to have that contribute to the downtown as being a viable place where people can live, work, have businesses, and contribute to a sense of a place that people want to be in. People don't want to be on a street with a parking garage. That's not their idea of a destination. It's it's maybe an inconvenient thing that we have to deal with for a few minutes, but then we get away from the parking structure as fast as possible. No one wants to linger there.
Right. I actually remember a comment you said in a TED Talk. It comes somewhere around minute 7:45. If anybody wants
you must have been studying it or something.
I just looked at it the other day, and I kind of memorized the location. You were talking actually about the city center's rear facade, I guess you would call it. And you used some pretty juicy language. It's just Google James Howard Kunstler City Center of Saratoga Springs or TED Talk, and you'll be able to find
the point of that
7:45.
The point of that riff was that we build these gigantic public buildings of one kind or another, and they end up being just blank walls on important streets, and they they literally kill the street. Nobody wants to go venture down that street anymore because there's nothing for them. There's no destination. There's no activity. The winos don't even want to go there. It's not. It's not active enough for them. And we've got quite a few of those dead spaces in town, and quite a few new ones from having created situations and conditions like that. We don't need another dead 200 yards of dead space on the street.
And you think that there's a likelihood that this could become a dead space if the plan is built in the way it is right now?
Oh, absolutely. Is this Henry Street out here?
High Rock Avenue.
High Rock. My guess would be that they probably wouldn't make provision for retail on Henry Street. And that would be another kind of that would be creating a condition that would persist for generations, perhaps. That it takes a long time to correct these things. These UFOs land and they don't fly away. You build a crummy strip mall on the site of the Grand Union Hotel, and it stays there for 45 years. You put up the Spring Valley Apartments, which, no offense to the Spring Valley Apartments, but they're basically suburban garden apartments in the center of town. They never should have been built there, but they've been there since 1970 or something. They're not going away. So you got to be very careful about the decisions that you're making about how they're going to affect the future.
Like once this thing is built, we're going to have it for a really long time.
And another thing is that even if there's a question that maybe the thing would have to be retrofit at some point, I don't think that there's any idea among the people proposing this thing now that it would have the capacity to be retrofit for what we call adaptive reuse.
It's kind of hard to imagine that happening with a 5-story parking garage.
Well, you would have to make provisions. For example, you'd have to make sure that each floor was higher. That have a higher ceiling, so you could put the services and the duct work and stuff in there. You'd have to make provision to knock out air shafts at some future point. If you were going to turn it into some other kind of structure. Generally, I don't think in America we've seen. I can't think of one example of a parking structure that's really been retrofit for other uses. And largely because at the time they were built, the designers weren't thinking about it.
It's just not a priority.
No, and it would certainly be more expensive than building just a straight up parking structure.
So there's also a problem with bottom line dynamics here.
Cheap, fast, and not so pretty.
So the issues that you mentioned with Saratoga politics and a sort of like a possible failure of long-term vision. Do you think that there's anything structurally about like the town political setup that is conducive to that? Like particularly like the short-term mayoral term in office?
I don't think that having a weak mayor helps. It doesn't help in any of these things, but I must say that you see this kind of behavior all across the country. So it has more to do with the consensus among, our leaders and sort of, the lack of education about urban design and the fact that people have gotten used to suburban outcomes, in the middle of the city over long periods of time, and they've gotten used to things being built in the city that, that are kind of semi-dysfunctional.
Right. So there's a kind of pervasive conditioned apathy in a way that to some extent, like the political elites of any particular municipality can kind of rely on when it comes to, the implementation of a project that may not be in the best interests of their city.
Yeah. And what these things really work against is the future walkability of our cities. Mm-hmm. If we really want to get back to having walkable towns, and I'm convinced that it's going to be imperative to do that, mm-hmm. a lot of the political behavior we're seeing now works against that in every way.
Right. Well, that goes a long way towards answering another question that I had written down, but maybe there's other aspects of it that you could touch on. So the question is, given your sense of the overall badness of this plan, and given the fact that it's been met with public opposition and petitions by the people of Saratoga, why do you think that it's been met with so little opposition by local elected officials?
I think it's clear that there's desperation to do anything that would supposedly enhance the tourist business, and I think it's an understandable kind of desperation, but it's not going to produce the best outcome. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's much more complicated than that.
That's what it reduces to. Could you connect that maybe to Saratoga history too? Because tourism goes through cycles, and I've seen exhibits in the Saratoga History Museum of massive structures that used to dominate Broadway, and then there was an economic downturn, but particularly like the Great Depression, and all of a sudden those structures were vacant.
Well, actually, the Great Depression was not so bad in Saratoga Springs because it had some industries like gambling, which actually allowed Saratoga to prosper compared to other places. Mm-hmm. The real depression in Saratoga happened in the post-World War II era, in the late 40s and then the early 50s when the Senate Commission essentially outlawed what remained of the gambling. Mm-hmm. And then by the mid-50s, you got a lot of the old wooden infrastructure decaying, and you didn't have cheap carpenters anymore who would work for $1 a day to fix them. And a lot of them became white elephants, and they were torn down. And then you had a number of catastrophic fires on the Main Street, Broadway. And that sort of illustrates some of the foolishness that occurred at that point. There was one particular stretch of Broadway, right in the center, across from what is now the Downtown Hotel, mm-hmm. which was the site, I believe, of the old Warden Hotel, which is one of the great, sort of public gathering places, especially the Warden Bar, mm-hmm. was a favorite gathering place for Saratogians. So across the street from that, there's a catastrophic fire in 1957, and the stuff that is rebuilt in the late 50s, early 60s is all one story, Well, that creates some interesting problems.
Was that out of fear that the buildings were too tall, and that's what caused the fire?
I don't think it was out of fear of that. I think it was just to get them built as fast and cheap as possible, just to get something there. Mm-hmm. And also because the suburban building modes were starting to appear in the center of the city. Mm-hmm. So if you're used to building most things one story in 1962,
right?
Then maybe in the center of town things will be one story as well. I mean, that's certainly the way it worked out. But the outcome of that was you get a building that produces far less value. It doesn't produce any rents for the guy who owns the one-story building is not getting upper-story rents, which reduces his income stream, which is foolish. Because over the life of the building, which could be 60, 100, 150 years, imagine the millions of dollars of revenue that's being lost because it didn't occur to you to put an upper story on your building.
Right.
It's just stupid.
Right.
But the tax revenue is also being lost because you've got a lower value building, and you could have, if you had a higher revenue stream in the building, then the city would have collected far more taxes on that property. So, You know, what that illustrates is, you know, you get very short-term thinking, you build a bad building, it stays there forever, and, you know, it does a certain amount of damage to the public interest.
Right.
As well as the private interest of the, you know, the people who own the buildings over the years.
So, you know, with that in mind, could you think that that could be extrapolated towards what's happening right now with some of the development that's going on in Saratoga?
Well, I think that much or most of the redevelopment that's occurred in Saratoga in the last 15 years has been pretty good. Mm-hmm. You know, like I said, some of the architectural details leave a bit to be desired, but in general, the buildings are behaving really well. They're really producing well. They're, you know, we've got a lot of livable units downtown, and by the way, the luxury housing of today is the affordable housing of the future. Remember that. If you don't build it, it'll never be there.
Right.
You know, by not building those upper stories on Broadway, you know, we sacrificed having 20 or 30 apartments that would have been there over time for people to live in locally. So that's a great thing. You know, we're getting a lot of business outside of the corridor of Broadway itself. Some of it is, you know, it's going to change over time. You know, it's not all going to be spas and, you know, hairdressers. Mm-hmm. You know, at some time in the future when, you know, Walmart is no longer doing its thing, and that age will come, you know, there will be other people having businesses in those spaces. So, you know, I don't think it's a great argument to say, oh, you know, those the buildings in railroad places don't count because, you know, they just have financial services in them now.
Right.
Now that's going to change.
So in a sense, what you think we need is more like the development that we've been having to a certain extent.
Yeah.
In the sense of, you know, buildings that perform well and have serve multiple functions and aren't just sort of mono-purpose monoliths that are sort of propped up in the middle of a neighborhood that maybe has some potential for other types of development.
Exactly. And you know, I just add two final things that, you know, I think that we need to get away from the idea of megastructures generally, that we need to reduce the scale and increment of redevelopment so that it becomes more normative with the historic pattern of, you know, 25, 40-foot frontages, you know, whatever they were. And I think that we need to get better at decorating the buildings and you know, developing an architectural language that's, you know, more than just minimal, more than just a gesture.
Right. And in that sense, this particular neighborhood that we're in right now is kind of at a crossroads, and that given the structures across the street right here, you could end up with this being the realm of the megastructures of Saratoga. At the same time, you do have the Mouzon house in High Rock Park, and if there was something that were built here that were more, you know, in line with the types of buildings you have downtown and set a little bit further back, you could have, you know, not the land of the megastructures. You could
well, you know, there's an idea, or shall we say a practice or principle in urban design that's fairly straightforward, and it's the idea that you have transitions between various districts and neighborhoods, and they have to be, you know, pretty consciously created. So, you know, what we are in here really is a transitional zone between the core of the urban core and then something a little bit beyond it. And that would suggest that you begin to get a smaller scale of building than you have at the very, 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 very center.
Right.
You know, going out towards the neighborhoods, which is, you know, what you're doing now in this particular place. So that there's some gradual transition, not just, you know, you have a, you know, an 8-story megastructure with a giant blank wall facing one way, and then there's a traditional house. You know, that's not going to work too well.
That's really dissonant.
Very dissonant.
Aesthetically unappealing in a lot of ways. Yeah. Okay, so well, one last question would be, what advice do you have for the people of Saratoga who oppose this plan?
Well, it's kind of tough politically because, you know, you're in the thick of the battle now, and it's not as though you're going to change the, you know, political structure of the town or the planning board or the zoning board, you know, during the course of this battle. I would, you know, decide on arguing on the basis of, you know, what really is the highest and best use for this piece of property, you know, going forward in the future more than 5 years. You know, that's what I would do if it was me.
Well, James, thank you very much for talking with us. This is a great conversation, and I hope to have you back on our YouTube channel at some time in the future.
Pleasure.
Thanks.